There is something that tires you even when your body is resting, an exhaustion that arises silently and grows when you try to love too much. But what if I told you that this loving too much was never love? Maybe it started with a small gesture, a sign of care, a constant presence, and without realizing it, you became everything to someone, except yourself. What seemed like affection turned into a cycle. Giving yourself, keeping quiet. And every time you try to get back to yourself, it feels like the ground disappears. It's as if there's an invisible force, one that doesn't scream, push, or hurt, but it consumes you, and the beautiful name they gave it was love. Today we're going to cross that veil, because only when you stop giving everything do you begin to see what was never true. If you feel that this topic resonates with something inside you, subscribe to the channel and show your support with a like. And if you've ever felt that you needed to hide to continue being loved, write in the comments, "I've kept quiet for love." That way you show that you are not alone and help others recognize themselves too. Because maybe what tires you the most is not what you feel, but the role you have learned to play. From an early age, you learn to be useful, to be strong, present, reliable, to be the one who listens, welcomes, supports, even when everything inside you was begging for rest. And this being needed became your identity, a character molded not by who you are, but by what others needed you to be. Maybe you were the lap you never had, the calm in the midst of chaos, the support for those who always fell apart and never looked at their own abyss. Maybe you learned this when you were little, when you understood that in order to maintain harmony, you had to silence your feelings. When you saw that, by behaving, you received affection. And when you questioned, you were pushed away. The character was born there, was not as a sham, but as armor, a genuine attempt to be loved in the world the way you were. Over time, loving became giving in, caring became keeping quiet, and keeping the relationship alive meant disappearing a little more each day. But when love demands your absence, it is not loving you, it is just using you as an emotional anchor. And every time you mold yourself to fit, a part of you breaks away with no return. What you call love may be the echo of the character you were forced to play. And when that character becomes your face, you start to forget who you are when you're alone. In many moments, what seemed like affection was just a response to a function. You were there, whole, present, giving without measure, but you were only seen while you were serving. You were only loved while you gave in. You were only loved while you kept the other person whole at your expense. And so, without realizing it, you began to measure your worth by your emotional usefulness. The more available you were, the more validated you felt. The more understanding you were, the more tolerated you were. The more silent you were, the more lovable you were. But there was a price, a high vibrational cost paid with your vital energy. The love that seemed to exist only flowed while you played your role. It was an invisible currency. You gave your soul, you received presence, until you were no longer useful. Then came the emptiness, the coldness, the distance, and you, believing you had failed, tried to give even more. This is the cycle of conditional affection. It is never satisfied, and the more you offer, the more it demands. It is like a thirst that never ends, but that also never belonged to you. You become the source for someone who doesn't want to learn to walk to their own well. And so, your energy becomes food. Your listening becomes an addiction. Your presence becomes a refuge from an escape that is never yours. This kind of affection is like an energetic parasite, delicate, subtle, but hungry. And you, trying to save the bond, gradually disintegrate. Because those who love hungrily do not nourish. They consume. But there comes a time when the heart grows weary, and you begin to realize maybe what you called love was just dependence disguised as affection. And that's when silence begins to call, as if to say, stop reacting and see what remains. When you finally shut up, the game changes. You don't fight, you don't explain, you don't justify, you just back off. And that's when everything is revealed. The absence of your reaction exposes what the other person was trying to control. Without your automatic yes, without your immediate acceptance, without your uninterrupted giving, the other person is lost. Some become cold. Others become aggressive. Some walk away with indifference. Others approach you desperately, trying to push you back into the role they no longer control. But what they all have in common is discomfort in the face of your silence. Because silence is not just the absence of sound, it is the presence of your energy returning to you. It is the mirror that the other person does not want to face, the one that shows that the love that existed there was conditional, functional, dependent. In silence, the veil falls. You realize that affection was measured, care was a reward, and the bond, an invisible contract of emotional obedience. Silence becomes like a vibrational field that disrupts control. It doesn't scream, but it reveals. Like a mirror that reflects back to the other what they have always avoided seeing, their own dependence, their own lack, their own illusion. And that's why silence is so uncomfortable. It doesn't confront, it just reflects. And then something subtle happens. You no longer feel guilty for not being there as expected, because you finally begin to see your absence revealed the true nature of the other's presence. As Jung said, what you do not make conscious will continue to direct your life, and you will call it destiny. For a long time, you reacted without realizing it. You molded yourself without noticing. You called love what was just unconscious repetition, an old script, an inherited echo, a need you learned to fulfill in order to be accepted. But there comes a moment when the character gets tired, and what emerges is the being that lay dormant beneath the functions. This return does not come with force. It comes with silence. It does not come with rebellion. It comes with clarity. It is as if your aura closes again, as if the field that was once vulnerable, exposed, and always open, now reorganizes itself, creating a vibrational boundary. You stop absorbing everything around you, and you finally begin to occupy your own space without fear of being noticed. You start listening to yourself instead of justifying yourself, choosing yourself instead of giving yourself away out of habit. And what once seemed like an obligation now feels like an invasion. That's when you start to realize the value of your energy, the strength of your absence, the power of not being where your soul gets sick. This is the restoration of sovereignty, the return of your center, the reintegration of your vibrational field, no longer divided between what others expect of you and who you really are. And the more you withdraw, the more your presence is purified. You are no longer accessible to those who only knew how to reach you when you were lost. There is a kind of love that does not demand performance. It does not measure your presence by how much you do, give, or solve. It simply remains. This love is rare because it is not interested in the mask. It wants to find the being behind the character. And that is where many walk away. Because when you stop offering everything, what is left is not a lack, it is a filter, it's clarity, it's energy, no longer flowing where it was once wasted. This true love is not offended by your silence. It doesn't collapse when you're not available. It doesn't need to control because it trusts. And perhaps that's why it's so scary to those who only know love as an exchange, as a silent contract of unspoken expectations. Love that doesn't demand, doesn't bind, but anchors. It doesn't demand explanations because it already recognizes the essence. It doesn't watch over your absence because it trusts your freedom. And perhaps most beautiful of all, it doesn't want you to be merely functional. It wants you whole with your light and with your shadow, This love is what remains when the theater ends. It is what is born when the persona falls away, as Jung would say, and what emerges is the essence, without masks, without function, without role. It is in this real presence that you begin to remember. You were never difficult to love. You were just loved many times by those who did not know what it was to truly love. Sometimes silence does not bring peace right away. It brings longing, but not for the person, but for yourself. A subtle memory emerges of what you were before you learned that you had to deserve love, before you associated presence with effort, before you confused acceptance with emotional obedience. Perhaps you remember the lightness that existed when you didn't have to be right, calm, or strong all the time. Maybe you miss your voice before it became too careful with those who could be hurt by anything. You begin to realize how many pieces you had to hide, erase, silence, just to fit into spaces where affection had invisible rules. And when that memory becomes clear, something inside you breaks. It's not just pain for what you've been through, it's pain for having accepted so little, for calling sacrifice normal, for confusing emotional survival with true love. The character you've played for so long begins to implode from within. And the strange thing is that, even in ruins, he still tries to keep you there. But you already feel it. Something has ended. And now, all that's left is to walk among the rubble of the old version of yourself, picking up the fragments of your soul that were left behind. This journey hurts, but it also purifies. And even if the breakup has already happened, it still hurts. Because when you leave a cycle like this, it's not just the other person who leaves. You also need to say goodbye to who you were, who you pretended to be, who hoped that love would return clean one day. This farewell is silent, but it is what makes room for the reunion with what was buried. It is in this symbolic mourning that the soul begins to remember itself, and the body begins to speak. The body feels before the mind understands. It carries the truth that you tried to ignore out of emotional loyalty, tiredness that doesn't go away, tension with no apparent cause, shortness of breath, always as if waiting for the next impact. The body keeps the unsaid. It absorbs every time you wanted to scream but smiled instead, every time you felt a boundary violated but said, "It's okay." It feels when your presence is not welcome, but necessary, when touch does not come with warmth, but with silent demands. The body reacts with vague pains, strange sensations, small forgetfulness, because the body, before it gets sick, tries to warn you. This emotional armor crystallizes in the muscles, the skin, the stomach. You can't explain why you feel drained, but your body knows. Carl Jung said that the body is the concrete manifestation of the unconscious, and it is there that the messages that the soul could not verbalize appear. The tightness in your chest, the weight on your shoulders, the lump in your throat. It all speaks, and if you listen carefully, you will realize that your body has never lied. It was just waiting for you to stop, to finally feel. There comes a time when the bond does not break on the outside, it breaks on the inside. That's when you stop trying to go back. You stop explaining yourself. You stop looking for a reflection in the other person that you no longer recognize. This separation is not made up of fights or visible breakups. It is made up of deep silences and silent decisions. You realize that the real breakup is not with the person, but with the character you forced yourself to be around them. And in that moment, something changes. You no longer feel guilty for choosing yourself. You no longer shrink to fit in. You no longer beg for spaces where your soul could never expand. This journey is sacred. It is the right of individuation, as Jung called it, when the inner being finally detaches itself from the images projected onto it. Separating from yourself is like dying while alive, but not in a tragic sense, rather in an initiatory sense. It is the old self that must fall, like leaves in autumn, so that the true self can blossom when silence finally fertilizes the inner soil. It is a symbolic death that heals, a sacred collapse. You cease to be what others expected you to be, to return to what you have always been, whole, imperfect, real. And even if it hurts, there is peace, because this time you are leaving yourself, only to return home. After the cut, there is emptiness. But this emptiness is not absence, it is space. A space where, for the first time in a long time, you can hear yourself. You can breathe without guilt, feel without watching yourself. It is in this new field that your energy begins to return, as if forgotten parts of you were finally coming home. There is no rush. Vibrational reconstruction is subtle. It begins with small, firmly spoken no's, with pauses that once seemed unbearable, with permission not to explain yourself or save anyone else. You begin to notice that you are less tired. Not because you slept more, but because you stopped being invaded. It's as if you are rebuilding an inner temple, brick by brick, boundary by boundary. And the more this temple rises, the more it emits a different vibration, one that only reaches those who vibrate with respect, not with need. Now you choose who enters, and what enters needs permission. It must respect the temple you have become, because now you no longer negotiate your light. You don't beg for belonging. You don't ask for love. You vibrate presence, and whoever finds you now will no longer find neediness. They will find the guardian of their own field. The field that once lay open now has contours, it has edges, it has presence. And in this new state, you begin to attract what is compatible with your essence, not with your neediness. Because your energetic tone has changed, and where there was once fear of loss, there is now gratitude for having found yourself again. You no longer need to lose yourself to be loved. You no longer need to extinguish yourself to keep someone else lit. You no longer need to fit where your soul never fit entirely. The love you sought outside begins to form inside, not as an idea, but as a presence, yours. Little by little you realize that silence is not emptiness, it is a home. It is sacred territory, where your energy begins to pulse with authenticity again, where your truth, even if silent, no longer fears being perceived. As Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you really are, and you are finally becoming that again. If something inside you recognized itself in this journey, subscribe to the channel. This is a space for those who are letting go of pretense and starting to simply exist. And in the comments, leave a symbol that represents your return. It can be a word, an image, a feeling, but let it mark, even if silently, the end of the cycle where loving meant annihilating yourself. Now, it's about inhabiting yourself.